Distinguished Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, members of the NGO and IO community, we're really thrilled that you're all here. Good morning and selamat datang. My thanks to all of the ministers and all of you here who are gathered from around the world. I particularly want to thank our host, Indonesia, and in doing so, President Sukarno, but also the extraordinary efforts of two ministers, of my friend Minister Retno and Minister Susi, both of whom have really been heroic in their efforts to pull this together. A remarkable setting, extraordinary demonstrations by many of you who are sitting here, and I congratulate you on that. And it speaks volumes that Minister Susi and Indonesia stayed on track, keeping this conference moving just weeks after the tsunami expressed Mother Nature's destructive mystery. I'm especially grateful also, if you permit me, to Donna Bertarelli and the Pew Bertarelli Ocean Legacy, and to Julie Packard and the Monterey Bay Aquarium for the work that we are all doing in partnership on a number of different efforts, which I don't have time to go into now. Obviously, it is enormously important to be having this meeting here in Indonesia. 17,000 islands, the largest archipelagic country in the world, more than 2/3 of its territory covered by water. We started the Our Oceans Conference not as an excuse to talk, but as an exhortation to act, to break the mold, to bring people from around the world together to recognize our shared concern and to react to science, not ideology, in order to unite our efforts to do what every speaker here today has talked about in protecting our ocean. I'm proud, and so should you be, of how far we have come since 2014. A global conference, which a little more than an idea 5 years ago, has become a movement. 5 conferences, $18 billion committed, 3.8 million square miles of newly protected ocean later, with the largest single protected marine protected area on the planet, with the Ross Sea, after Russia stopped objecting and joined in moving forward, and we are still working. The movement isn't just alive, it is essential, living in its own, if you will. It's as if the ocean is speaking to us and the life within the ocean is crying out to us for change. And it's enduring because since the first conference, Chile, and then the US again, and then EU, now Indonesia, next up Norway, and then Palau, they all raised their hands and volunteered to keep it going because they sense the urgency. We all recognize that stewardship of the ocean is not a personal passion, though it will be driven by personal passions and must be, but it is also not the project of any one nation. And I certainly guarantee you that the notion of one nation first before all others is not the way that we will protect the ocean. It's a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility that affects a $500 billion global economy and the livelihoods of 12% of the world's population. It's a policy choice that's fundamental for more than 1 billion people worldwide who depend on fish as their primary source of protein. It is about the next generation being able to count on the oceans the same way that our generation took it for granted, until sometimes pushing it to the brink of breaking. But none of us can be content to come to Bali and simply pat ourselves on the backs for the commitments made and the things that we've accomplished, as astonishing as they are. And I'd love to lay them all out, but I think most of you know them, and again, I don't have time. But let's make it clear, this is not the time to rest on laurels. Not when all over the globe there is too much money still chasing too few fish. Not when on the high seas there is still too little enforcement. As our friend Timor-Leste reminds us, there are still more than 400 unresolved maritime boundary disputes, which have, unfortunately, compounded the problem of ungoverned ocean spaces. There are still pirate fishermen by the thousands. Susie was telling me how many thousands of ships from one country alone are pirating out there, painting their ships the same color as others, putting the same numbers on them as others, carrying multiple flags, which you will see in the demonstration out there, which they just change as they move from area to area. And they are strip mining the oceans, dangerously exploiting fish stocks that have sustained life for generations. Illegal fishing globally still decimates fisheries at an unsustainable pace, with factory ships out there that just manufacture the product, take it out, and still, despite the port-state measures, which is progress, find a place to sell it. Illegal fishing continues on an unmitigated, unsustainable pace, and almost 1/3 of the world's fisheries are still overexploited. And the other 2/3, folks, are either at peak or nearly at peak, with more and more people in the middle class, more and more people with money, more and more people demanding fresh fish on their table, in their restaurant, in their country. Indifference and lack of enforcement and personal irresponsibility still contribute to a garbage patch of plastic the size of the state of Texas in America floating in the Pacific. And rising carbon dioxide levels from emissions still increase ocean acidity and devastate coral reefs and marine life. So, what do? We have no choice. We have to demand more. We have to make the choices that we know we face, actually voting issues in those countries that get to vote. Where they aren't, put the pressures on the leadership to move. We have to demand that all public persons on this planet get serious about two realities that are staring us in the face. First, if we don't do a better job globally of protecting the oceans, there will be no blue economy. There'll be an unrecognizable fishing industry which will pit country against country and promote even more money-driven decision-making than we face today. And we can't protect our oceans if we can't show people everywhere that done right, protecting the oceans doesn't hurt jobs, it is jobs. And second, you can't protect the oceans without solving climate change. And you can't solve climate change without protecting the ocean. And we need to get people around the planet to understand that connection. You don't have to be a scientist or a leader of government to understand that the reason dozens of nations are sitting here side by side is because time is running out. Climate change itself is changing the basic chemistry of the ocean faster than it has in the last 50 million years. It is threatening some marine life that may simply die out because it can no longer survive in the very waters that have nourished it since time began. There are more than 500 dead zones now, growing in number throughout the ocean, areas where life simply cannot exist. And the damage has now reached such an extreme level that unless we change our practices by the middle of this century and sooner, there will be more plastic in the water, in the ocean, than fish. Now, I mention this not to create a sense of an insurmountable task. I don't believe it's insurmountable. It's not. We have the capacity to make these choices. There isn't one problem we face with respect to the ocean or respect to climate change that isn't human-induced and therefore subject to human solution. The problem is that it is man-made, but it's not a question of whether or not we have the capacity to fix this now. It's a question of whether we have the political will, whether we can break away from some powerful money interests that prevent the right decisions from being made. we can restore the health of our ocean. And we can exceed our commitments by far under the Paris Accords and do what the science tells us we have no choice but to do. So here's the stark reality. And I'm going to bring it up because you can't talk about this in a vacuum. The latest IPCC report underscores with historic precision that even meeting the goals of Paris, which I had the privilege of negotiating for the United States, even meeting those goals doesn't get it done. Boil it down, and here's what that report tells us. Global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade between 2030 and 2052. And if it continues to increase at the current rate, we're going to hit the 0.5 increase on where we are already, with devastating consequences within the next 12 years. 12 years is the target we have for governments to become responsible, for leaders to lead. And the fact is that the changes required to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees, as called for in the Paris Agreement, would in and of themselves require changes, and I quote, with no documented historic precedent. Meanwhile, we're headed towards a 4-degree centigrade increase in this century. Now, we knew when we left Paris, I said it on the floor of the plenary before we walked away, that we were not going to hold the Earth's temperature to 2 degrees centigrade. We knew that. But what we knew we were doing was sending the most powerful signal ever sent by a conglomeration of nations to the marketplace to say the world is committed to move in this direction. And indeed, the thing we wanted to have happen happened. The private sector poured $358 billion into alternative, renewable, sustainable energy. The first time ever that more money went into sustainable energy investment than fossil fuel in all of human history. So we got the response. The question now is whether or not we will do what we know we need to do, not to get it done. It'll happen someday. But will it happen with a totally altered Earth in which so many people lose in so many ways that we compound the other choices we have with refugees from nations that can't produce their food, that don't have water, and that are pressing on the gates of Europe or America or other countries? And we already see how that's discombobulating the politics of the world. So we've done many things. You know them. Established great parks. We've come up with massive amount of money. We're doing better research. We're moving in the right direction. The designation of many of the national parks, and New Caledonia is going to have an announcement later, and other things we're doing. And the marine protected areas are critical, and we'll have a plenary meeting on that shortly. So let me just close by saying to everybody that it does take a village to resolve this problem. The great thing we have going for us is that we don't have to wait for someone at one of the great scientific universities of the world, whether it's in America or Europe or China or anywhere. We don't need to wait for someone to discover the solution to climate change. We know what it is. It's energy policy. Make the right choices about how we move our vehicles, make the right choices how we produce electricity, make the right choices about what we do to create sustainability. It's all there. Solar is now purely less expensive than coal. It just is. Because nobody ever measures the cost of black lung or environmentally induced asthma, which is the greatest cause of children being hospitalized in America in the summer. Costs us $55 billion a year. 3 storms last year cost us $265 billion. More water dropped on Houston in 5 days than goes over Niagara Falls in a year. A once in 50,000 year storm, but it's happening not once every 50,000 years now. So what we're looking at is a question that rises above partisanship. It doesn't have a conservative or a liberal, or shouldn't, doesn't have an R or D, doesn't have whatever parliamentary breakdown you have in your countries. It has an urgent, human, compelling rationale that we have to get leaders to listen to. Or you think we're paying money now? Wait till you see what happens with adaptation and mitigation when we have not moved fast enough to deal with even 0.5 degrees increase as we hurtle towards 4 degrees. So I'll just tell you why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because even though the president of my country decided personally and without any scientific basis to pull out of the Paris Agreement, even though he made that decision, the next day 38 states in the United States reinforced with their governors that each of them has a renewable portfolio law, and they're going to live up to the law. And over 1,000 mayors came together and said, we're going to continue to try to meet the Paris Agreement. And those 38 states represent 80% of the population of the United States. So Donald Trump may have pulled out of Paris, but I got news for you. The American people are staying in Paris, and we're going to try to meet and exceed that goal. In addition, so I close by how do we get serious? How do we break out of the mold and do what we need to do? Well, let me be very blunt and let me be bold and put a larger vision on the table. Here's what I think we have to do. I think we have to make certain, number one, that no country, except where it is a matter of absolute fuel and economic necessity and where the finance situation is such there's no choice, no country should be financing or building a coal-fired power plant in this day and age in the world, period. Secondly, we made a pledge in Paris to create a $100 billion fund. That has now got about $10 billion of pledges to it, but only $3 billion of actual cash being put forward. $1 billion of which President Obama slid into the budget before we left, and this administration is not empowered to take it out because it's signed into law. But they're not putting anything additional in. Here we have China spending $1 trillion on one belt, one road. It is inconceivable to me that the G20 shouldn't come together. Someone ought to have the courage to lock the door and say we're not leaving here until we have fully funded the Green Climate Fund so we can help smaller nations to make the transition they have to make and to undo practices like peat burning and other things that need some money to support those farmers. That's what we ought to do. The third thing we ought to do is start treating this like the issue it is. In the 1950s and 60s, what brought me into public life was the nuclear freeze and arms control and the issues of peace. We were still at war in Vietnam. But now, folks, we need to face up to the fact that we've got to treat this issue of the oceans and the protection of the oceans and the protection of the planet with the same urgency that we treated arms control, nuclear weapons, non-proliferation treaty. We need a non-proliferation treaty for pollution in the oceans. We need a global agreement where everybody is agreeing on how we're going to enforce, on how we enforce on the high seas, how we contribute. We either do it through the United Nations or we do it through a separate entity, but we need to do that. And those, I think, are the most critical things to raise this issue up even one tier further. I don't know how else to do it, folks. I really don't. I've been at this, as many of you have, for 30 years or more. So my hope is we will do it. I'll close by saying to you, remember this. Nelson Mandela reminded us when he came out of jail after 27 years and South Africa transitioned. He said, it always looks impossible until it is done. Well, it may look that way to some of you now. I don't think so. It is possible. We have to make it a voting issue. We have to galvanize action. You all are the spokespeople for that. Every one of you is an ambassador. Every one of you is an activist. And we have to recommit ourselves to do what Mandela said and get it done. Thank you.
Thank you.